question at issue was the dictatorship of the working class, which was leading, or to be more correct, was capable of leading the millions of the poorest peasantry. This was the historical meaning of the October Rising. On October 24th and 25th, workers rose up and seized the Winter Palace along with other government installations and key points of communications. The insurrection was organized by the Bolshevik Party, the Petrograd Soviet, and its Military Revolutionary Committee. Trotsky declared that the provisional government was overthrown and that all power would be transferred to the Soviets. Hardly a shot was fired during this process, with only scattered skirmishes taking place. There was no mass support left for the provisional government, so hardly anyone rallied to save it. Kerensky's attempts to restore power militarily crumbled due to lack of support. After the insurrection, the Second Congress of Soviets was held on October 25th and 26th. The SRs and Mensheviks denounced the insurrection and called for the restoration of Kerensky's provisional government. Seeing that this was not going to happen, they stormed out in protest. And the Second Congress then immediately passed decrees on peace negotiations, land reform, and a resolution passing all power into the hands of the Soviets. The Bolsheviks asked the Mensheviks and the SRs, which had now split into right and left-wing factions, to join the Soviet government on October 26th. But all these parties refused to join the government, though in November the left-wing faction of the SRs would actually join into the government with the Bolsheviks. So by December, both left SRs and Bolsheviks occupied key positions in the Soviet government. And I just wanted to point this out to illustrate that the Bolsheviks had no intent on creating a one-party state. They were very open, even throughout the late 1919, 1920. They were completely open to working with other organizations and allowing them to participate in the government. The key point of support, though, was that they had to support, the Soviets. They had to support a working class government, and that was the one condition upon which you could sort of participate in the government. You couldn't participate if you were trying to sabotage the government, the working class government that was being set up. So, but the insurrection didn't immediately solve the dual power situation, which had been existing in the country. The right SRs and Mensheviks rallied around the convocation of the Constituent Assembly that was set to convene in January. The provisional government had said shortly after the February Revolution that it was going to convene a Constituent Assembly, but continued to put it off. So after the provisional government fell, the SRs and the Mensheviks and some of the elements of the capitalist class were trying to get them to form this Constituent Assembly, which would basically form the basis of a capitalist parliamentary democracy along the lines of Western Europe and the United States. Elections to the Assembly were held in November, and it was scheduled to meet on January 5th, 1918. The Bolsheviks and left SRs planned to introduce a resolution to the Assembly that was authored by Lenin, called the Declaration of the Rights of Toiling and Exploited People, that would ratify Soviet power and endorse the historic resolutions passed at the Second Congress of Soviets, which was the decrees on form of government, land reform, peace, etc. The SRs, on the other hand, planned on using the Constituent Assembly to dissolve the Soviets and form a new capitalist coalition government. This is the context of the meeting of the Assembly on January 5th. The Assembly was convened at 1 p.m. on the 5th and went well into the night and early the following morning. Speeches were given by delegates in support of Soviet power and against Soviet power. A resolution put forth by the SRs that ignored Soviet power altogether and declared the Constituent Assembly the sole power in the land. The resolution was passed by the Assembly, and the Bolshevik left SR resolution was ignored altogether. At this point in the Assembly, the left SR Steinberg took the podium and declared that the delegates at the Assembly either were to at least consider the resolution and bring it up to a vote, or show their counter-revolutionary nature and that they were trying to undermine the government. But the SR delegates at the conference refused to consider the declaration, So the Bolsheviks and left SRs resigned in protest of this open attempt to remove power from the hands of the working class form of government. The withdrawal statement of the Bolsheviks that was read out at the conference, I'll just read a section of it here. The vast majority of laboring Russia, workers, peasants, soldiers, presented the Constituent Assembly with a demand that it recognizes the triumphs of the Great October Revolution, and most important of all, the authority of the Soviets of workers, soldiers, and peasants' deputies. However, a majority of the Constituent Assembly, in agreement with the pretensions of the bourgeoisie, rejected this proposal, thereby defying all Russian toilers. Not for a minute wishing to hide the crimes of the enemies of the people, we Bolsheviks hereby announce our withdrawal from this Constituent Assembly in order to let Soviet power decide on a policy toward the counter-revolutionary part of the Constituent Assembly once and for all. During the fraction meeting of the Bolsheviks that took place during the assembly, Lenin urged that no violence be used to disperse of the Constituent Assembly under any circumstances, and he was quoted saying, "Let the delegates just go home. Let them just go home." Lenin realized that the assembly didn't have mass support from the population, and even more so if it was intent on dissolving the Soviets. He knew that workers and peasants would support the Soviets and not the formation of a new capitalist government that completely excluded them. So at 4 a.m. on January 6th, the Bolsheviks and left SRs resigned from the Constituent Assembly to protest the intransigence of the right SR delegates. The meeting then dismissed about an hour later, and this was the last time the Constituent Assembly would ever hold a meeting. So before I go on to sort of describe the situation of the Russian Civil War and what happened after that, I want to outline some of the achievements that the Bolsheviks put in power in the earliest days of the Soviet government being in power. All anti-gay legislation was abolished, which didn't happen in the United States until, I think, the 1960s. Men and women were given equal rights to marriage and divorce. Voting rights were granted to all men and women in the country ages 18 or older. Women were given the right to abortion, free on demand, and so abortion was legalized in Russia over 50 years before it was legalized in the United States. Communal kitchens and laundromats were set up to free women from the drudgery of housework. Youth hostels were set up for teenagers trying to escape from oppressive family environments. Workers were given control over industry, and private ownership of land was set about to be abolished and declared the common ownership of workers and peasants. Oppressed nationalities within Russia, and the Russian Empire was called the Prison House of Nations because it had sort of taken over so many pieces of territory that had, and just sort of encompassed so many ethnic minorities in the country. So these oppressed nationalities and oppressed ethnic minorities, such as Ukrainians, Finns, etc., were given the right to self-determination or free association with the Soviet government. And the Bolsheviks also took immediate measures to enter peace negotiations with the Central Powers and achieve an end to World War I. The implementation of all these policies was not simple, however, because of the domestic and international crisis which the Soviet government found itself in. There were many threats to Soviet power in the very first days after the October uprising. The main threats to the Soviet government were German invasion, internal counter-revolution, both from the White Armies and from the actions of some left-wing groups, foreign military intervention and aid to the counter-revolution, and the isolation of the revolution from the international scene, namely Western and Central Europe. After conducting a survey of the army, which proved it was in shambles, Lenin concluded on the need for accepting an immediate peace with Germany. Many people in the Soviets, namely the left SRs and the left communist faction of the Bolshevik Party, argued that there was a need for continued military resistance to German imperialism. But with the old army in